As we get started, I did want to acknowledge that we intended to have this meeting at Kapi'olani Community College. I'd like us to begin by acknowledging that we all still exist on land. We do not only live in cyberspace, although it's begun to feel that way. I wanted to begin by welcoming everyone on behalf of Kapi'olani Community College and the University of Hawaii System, and to respectfully offer a land acknowledgement. So wherever you are, just take 1 minute, look out the window, and take a breath in. I want to recognize Hawaii as an indigenous space and ask all of us to honor the indigenous people, traditional stewards of this land who've lived and worked in Hawaii for generations upon generations. We would have gathered here in the mo'o of Kahalu, the ahupua'a of Kapahulu, and the moku of Kona on the island of Oahu. And we're here to advance Hawaii's contribution to global climate change solutions by keeping close the indigenous values of aloha aina, kinship to the land. I want to introduce today's panelists and let you know the flow that we'll be following. First, we'll hear from 3 of Hawaii's most highly regarded experts in various aspects of climate science and sociology of climate policy, social justice. So I'd like to share their bios with you here at the beginning. And then we'll have a Q&A moderated by my colleague at the University of Hawaii Office of Sustainability, Matthew Lynch. I'll be putting you into breakout rooms where you'll get to talk with other students, faculty, and hopefully Makena, Chip, and Lala will be able to stay for that as well. And then we'll do a short report back with the goal of really narrowing down what are Hawaii's top solutions to climate change. And I'll invite some closing comments from Bob Franco. So here we go. Our first speaker will be Lala Nuss. Lala, in September of 2019, Lala joined the City and County of Honolulu's Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency as the Climate Resilience and Equity Manager. Lala is dedicated to cultivating the practice of interweaving corporate and grassroots island global perspectives and holistic approaches to centering equitable emergent solutions that are genuinely reflective of and appropriate to people and place. Makena Coffman is a professor and department chair of urban and regional planning at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. She teaches graduate courses in urban economics, environmental planning, and policy. Her research interests include greenhouse gas mitigation, energy policy, and alternative transportation strategies. She has a BA in International Relations from Stanford, a PhD in economics from the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. And she's a research fellow with the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization and the chair of the Honolulu Climate Commission. And our last speaker will be Dr. Charles Chip Fletcher, Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and a professor in the Department of Earth Sciences at the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology, SOEST, at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. He's also vice chair of the Honolulu Climate Change Commission, teaches graduate and undergraduate courses emphasizing earth science, climate change, coastal community resiliency, paleoclimatology, and sedimentology. He has been the principal advisor in awarding over 30 graduate research degrees and received a number of teaching, research, and community service awards. Thank you to Makena, Lala, and Chip for being here. I want to be sure that we can see the speakers as they're speaking. Makena, can you turn your video back on? There she is.
Sure. I can see that.
Hi, I'm going to turn
Am I
myself
first or
off.
is Lala?
You're actually first.
Okay.
I'm going to stop my video so that you'll pop up. Okay. How does the screen look? Does it look right to you, Makena?
No, I'm seeing you, Krista, but a picture of you, not you live. I'm not seeing my slides.
Okay.
And while you're pulling that up, I just really wanted to thank you, Krista and Bob and Matt, for pushing this event along even remotely. So mahalo for organizing and pushing it forward.
Okay. How about now, Makena?
Yeah, I can see them if you can put them in the full view.
Okay.
And given the format, I thought I would try to keep my slides fairly simple.
Yes.
So I'll just delve in. So I titled this climate change mitigation, it's still urgent, but now what, right? I think that our current experiences are obviously absolutely shaping everything we're thinking about now, and how do we move forward, particularly in the next few years. And in terms of, the solving climate by 2030, what do we do? I think my message is, we can't blink, even though this is a really important experience. We do need to keep our focus on climate mitigation in terms of the work we do, of course, in new context, right? And a lot of what we're hearing in the news are, that, oh, sorry, punctuation turned out strange there, but it's okay. That we're seeing this kind of dramatic reduction in air pollution, and we're, these visuals. So this visual you see here is from NASA, and it's January and February observations of nitrogen dioxide levels in China, mainly above Wuhan. And you can see that it's pretty amazing how quickly the air pollution has dispersed, right? And we're, the nitrogen dioxide is not necessarily a direct greenhouse gas, but it is an indicator of fossil fuel activities, right? Mainly of transportation, but also industrial activities. And it's declined incredibly rapidly as a result of our shutdown. And, this isn't news to anybody, but what we always know is that fossil fuel use and economic activities basically walk hand in hand. But this isn't necessarily the way we want to see the reductions happen, right? So just in terms of a magnitude of reductions, a recent New York Times article said that China's reduced greenhouse gas emissions by about 25%, which is 200 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. For context, that's approximately 10 times Hawaii's annual emissions, right? So this short blip in terms of reductions from a large emitter is about 10 times our size, right? So if we're looking for silver linings right now, that is I suppose a slight silver lining, but it is also somewhat temporary. Can you go to the next slide, Krista? So in terms of what we should expect in terms of greenhouse gas emissions for 2020 and potentially beyond, right? There's so much uncertainty right now in terms of our timeframes and activities. We should expect a dramatic reduction in transportation emissions. Obviously, most of air transportation emissions, or quite a bit. For Hawaii, just to give you context, air transportation emissions are about 20% of our annual emissions. And so for 2020, we should see a good portion of that slashed, right? This is a US sort of general inventory in terms of composition. We would also expect a reduction in industrial activities. Definitely to be seen in terms of how much and how deep these cuts are. But I think the message I want to try to get across is, these are good things in terms of global carbon budgets, but this is absolutely not the way we wanted to get this done, right? That pandemics are not a long-term solution to the climate crisis, as some of the popular media is kind of putting forth. And in fact, in terms of the long-term solutions, this worries me about our abilities to move forward on policy options. And that's why I think my overall message is, we have to stay steadfast in terms of moving forward on climate policy and climate mitigation policy, even in the face of what is expected to be an incredibly large recession, although levels to be determined. Next slide, Krista. And the Great Recession of 2008, I think, provides a really cautionary tale, right? So we had similar kinds of metrics, not quite so dramatic. We weren't on stay-at-home orders. We had similar metrics in terms of reduced greenhouse gas emissions related to the Great Recession. But what we saw was, as soon as the economic activities picked up, so did greenhouse gas emissions again. But what it also served to do was dramatically undermine the policy efforts that had been in place, right? While it's a little hard to say definitively that the variety of policies fell apart because of the recession, it's also really hard to believe that the recession didn't play a substantial role. So for example, the Waxman-Markey bill, sorry if you're hearing that beeping, I don't really know how to get away from it to stop. The Waxman-Markey bill became the American Clean Energy and Security Act in 2000, and it passed in 2009, sort of right in the middle of the recession. It passed through the House, but failed to pass through the Senate, right? And it would have established a national cap and trade program. And there was a huge groundswell of momentum for a national cap and trade program at that moment. It was the first year of President Obama's term. He had run his campaign on an incredibly aggressive climate change mitigation platform. But then suddenly we are in the midst of this huge recession, not seen since the Great Depression, right? And what that did was it really, I think, created political context where any kind of new pricing was seen as not possible, right? And the different regional efforts also fell apart, right? So there was the Western Climate Initiative, which Hawaii was actually strongly considering signing on to, would have been a regional cap and trade program, kind of in the face of if ACES wasn't going to pass at the national level, that there would have been a large regional effort. The Western Climate Initiative still exists, and California is its leader, but really it didn't gain much traction in the US post-2009 as a result of the recession. The other thing that happened was oil prices plummeted, right? We had a really large oil price spike, which got everybody's attention. The Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative was born in 2008, largely in response to that oil price spike. But with economic downturn also comes the downturn of world oil prices, right? And that's one of the major challenges within this market, is that high prices beget low prices, which then begets more demand, right? So we're seeing the same happening right now. West Texas is down at $20-some a barrel, right? We haven't seen world oil prices this low. Actually, it's even lower than it was in real dollars from the Great Recession, right? So as we come out of this, prices resume, but low prices mean that shifting our markets away from renewable energy sources. Even though I think what Evan said in our opening remarks was absolutely right, renewable energy prices have come down so dramatically, and that's a really positive thing. It's always got to be relative to the current technology, right? So with world oil prices being so low, that is going to be an uphill challenge without policy intervention, which is why we can't turn away from the policy efforts. The other thing that happened in 2008, interestingly, was that in Hawaii was the barrel tax was actually passed, right? And there, the barrel tax is a very, very small amount, it's just a little over $1 on a barrel of oil. It's, any amount, of course, can be seen in terms of impact into pricing, but it's very small. The effect in terms of changes behavior, I would say, are also very small. But mainly it was passed within the Great Recession as a tool to raise government revenues in order to keep core programs running. So kind of an interesting moment when what we would consider a climate-like policy passed, but not necessarily for the purpose, or there was some purpose of reducing fossil fuel use, but a lot of it was for the revenues to invest into programs rather than the price signal itself, right? And I would also offer that as a cautionary tale, right? Carbon mitigation tools that are economically efficient, right? So things that are like carbon pricing, a carbon tax, a cap and trade program, they're probably more important than ever right now, especially when we're dealing with times when we're going to be facing massive budget cuts. It is, you know, admittedly a very hard sell. We've obviously experienced that in the US context for years. But they're going to be incredibly important right now to get right in terms of both what they can do in terms of greenhouse gas mitigation, as well as equity, right? If we view this necessarily as a revenue tool, then we're not going to be able to offset the regressivity of these programs to low income households and people. And I think that at this point is going to be the really, really core and important design of any kind of carbon pricing program that we would want to see at the state and of course the national level, although I don't have much hope for that at anytime soon. So I think one of the other things is we know that the federal package is coming down. Can we make some of our renewable energy projects, you know, the term that was used in the Great Recession was shovel ready. I put that a little bit in quotations because we know these projects are hard to make shovel ready. The permitting, the siting, all have to be done really carefully in terms of mitigating impacts to communities. So, but there are probably ways to be more proactive about that than not. And it's also very uncertain what's coming down in terms of the federal package. But to the extent that we can, right, to the extent that state and local governments have discretion in how we get people back to work, renewable energy projects are a really fantastic way to do that. And incorporated in that could also be sort of best practices for siting and community input into the inclusion into the process. So I think this is kind of where I want to end. And, you know, I'm really happy to chat more in the breakout groups, but my overall message is, you know, it is a good thing that, or within the relative context, a good thing that emissions are going down, at least temporarily. But this is a temporary phenomenon, and we really need to focus on climate mitigation. As Evan said, it's, you know, we're seeing how fragile we are, and these are the shocks that we're going to experience. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Makena. A couple of things that I heard there are just that there are some pricing and policy solutions that we could engage, and also that renewable energy might be a way of getting people back to work and addressing the recession and climate change. So that would be a great thing to learn more about. As folks have questions, please type them into the chat box, and Matt Lynch will be moderating and synthesizing some Q&A at the end of all three speakers, okay? So Lala, I want to invite you to turn your video on, and just let me know when you'd like me to advance your slides. And I'd like to welcome Lala Nuss. Thank you.
Hi, aloha, mahalo kusta. Can you see me? Okay, great. Aloha mai kākou. Thank you for this opportunity. This is my first official presentation virtually. So forgive me and ride through with me as we move through this space. So my role is quite new to the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency, really occupying a program specific to climate, community resiliency, and specifically equity. And as we know, and we're experiencing now, inequities are exacerbated by shocks and ongoing stressors, whether that's environmental, economic, or public health-wise. And to give kind of a little bit of perspective as to where we are in Hawaii, or specifically on Oahu, in regards to climate equity, is, I would say, overall, we have been practicing this officially in government, climate change, establishing the Office of Climate Change 3 years ago. So this is still quite a new space of officially working and operating within government context. And add to that, the idea of equity is even a newer space. So we really are kind of in, I would say, in comparison to other cities like Seattle or King County and Portland, Los Angeles, even Boston, we're kind of still in a toddler phase of establishing justice and equity frameworks, programs, policies specific to prioritizing environmental justice values. one of my priorities, or the equity program's priorities, is to support increasing a robust and interconnected and organized social and environmental justice ecosystem for the island of Oahu, and hopefully expanding into the state. And so what I'm sharing with you today are some frameworks that I've been learning that are being used nationally, and how are we calibrating these national frameworks to be representative and reflective, specific to Hawaii's unique culture and island-based values, and the incorporation of centering equity in all aspects of climate initiatives. So you can see here, and we're looking at defining equity, what does that mean to us here in Hawaii? The image kind of gives you a sampling. This is probably seen by quite a few people, but it's comparing what equality versus equity is, sameness versus fairness, and in really trying to determine the definition that is reflective of our unique people and place in comparison to the US or continental frameworks, is language plays a really important role. And so incorporating our root cultures, value systems, and language, the communities that I've been able to reach out to talking about this idea of climate equity, the word pono kept coming up. And doing some research online around that and asking kupunan practitioners, how is this incorporated into equity? You can kind of see some of the definitions of what pono means, and how can that be a guiding principle in our climate equity work here. A little bit of framework around different areas where equity is needing to be looked at and practiced. We're looking at procedural, distributional, structural, and intergenerational. Procedure, of course, is looking at processes, right? Explicitly prioritizing and being informed by frontline voices into policy and protocols of private and public sector planning and implementation. Community-based advisory groups are one of the ways that are being practiced in other cities that have been doing climate justice and equity work for the past 15, 20 years, officially within government and community. And they need to be included in all phases of projects, starting with the conceptual and planning phases. And I think we're seeing some of that breaking down of trust or challenges within our abilities to, there's a continued separation of trust in that, when we're not really, more and more community is wanting to be involved and a part of co-creating the making and decision making within their communities. So we're really gonna have to, in order to mitigate future challenges or disruptions and pushbacks from community, they actually have to be centered and a part of the conversation from the beginning, so we can mitigate any challenges. Because the reality is we do have to move this as far as adaptation and mitigation efforts quickly. And so how do we start from the beginning in doing that? Distributional is looking at benefits are distributed to prioritize those most in need, right? So actions and outcomes. Goals of outcomes for our project, program, policy that are prioritizing frontline communities, and measurement of success is based on reflecting the direct benefits of identified frontline communities and individuals. And I'm using the term frontline versus vulnerable communities, and the idea of identifying or labeling a community as vulnerable has some inequity frameworks in and of itself. So instead, like, how are we uplifting and prioritizing, using, again, language being so important, using the connotation of frontline has been more and more practiced in identifying equity initiatives. You know, a couple of distributional components to our current scenario with COVID is looking at what are some of the mechanisms that can be incorporated, you know, the earned income tax credit, or taking advantage of the TANF resources or reserves, which there's 300 million that haven't been used yet, that we can start looking at prioritizing frontline community stabilization. Structural, you know, you're looking at refining and restructuring and repurposing communication, outreach efforts, and protocols of decision-making to reflect standards of trust building, inclusivity, and community-driven agency. Looking at the intergenerational, it's something that our root culture, our Kanaka Maoli culture here is just innately practiced at, and looking at not just short-term, say, looking at our political cycles every 4 years we're having to, or every 2 years, is really short-term thinking overall. And how can we start expanding that, or helping to facilitate continuity between these institutional timelines and the reality of the longer timelines, to where we can actually diversify and demonstrate how a policy project or plan is beneficial to long-term sustainability, informed by the communities that will be impacted by them. And I think there's a lot of untapped abilities and resources in that area. Looking at our frontline factors, it gives you an idea of how are we starting to identify who our frontline communities are. And there is some really good resources out there. One of the frameworks that is used widely and the state is potentially wanting to help create or facilitate is a social vulnerability index for the whole state. A great report that we're using now is the Alice report, if you guys are familiar with that, and looking at, the reality is 48% of the state's population is pretty much working poor. They're living paycheck to paycheck or below. That's half of our population. And so it's not this small percentage of community that are struggling. It's literally half of our society that is not being able to sustain themselves. So frontline factors, one of the big things that are being spoken of in practice within equity work is first and foremost needing to acknowledge the realities of a system that has been historically unjust to certain explicit demographics. And instead of a community being initially viewed as vulnerable, the need for communities to define their assets and strengths is really crucial. So we're wanting to shift processes and even government's role to be more supportive and facilitative in these areas. So we're looking at more of this co-creating frameworks there's quite a bit of success stories in other cities around the nation globally that are really incorporating this front and center. Next slide. Thank you, Krista. So what does it mean when we're looking at being rooting for resilience? And these are, again, some of the national frameworks that cities are incorporating and using as guiding principles. And one of those things is evaluation, right? Like when we're looking at place-based people power, how can we really start identifying community-led decision-making? And these are different, the quadrant on the left there. If we're looking at these different spaces of identifying power and influence, space one is highly impacted, little influence. Should we prioritize an inclusion of decision-making processes and planning? These you could say I would identify, for an example, is our COFA communities, youth, rural communities that have less access, time, or capacity to participate in decision-making processes. And so those, how do we start restructuring our current operations to adjust, to provide more access and capacity for those communities to be involved? Space two is looking at highly impacted and highly influential communities. And these could be community leaders, union leaders, established nonprofit directors that represent or come from those communities and individuals in space one that have greater capacity and influence with power structures and decision making. And my question kind of is, how do we get more of these individuals into influential leadership roles, right? I think one of the initiatives you could say within even our own office is really prioritizing our Vistas program, AmeriCorps Vistas program, to say, how are we recruiting? How are we prioritizing local communities, talents, and abilities to be represented in our own office? And these are the things that we're working through, right? Space three, you're looking at those that are less impacted and highly influenced or have low influence. And that could be considered, say, an EV car owner. They have the ability to transition from fossil fuel to electric, but they're not impacted by the gas tax, for example. Whereas individuals that don't necessarily have that financial stability to transition an automobile are directly impacted by some of these mechanisms that we have. So how do we transition and be really mindful of, like, how are we bringing everyone along? And then space 4 is like less impacted, high influence, and that's looking at established institutional private sector leaders that maybe are not burdened by the impacts and have strong influence in decision-making structures. Maybe those are the CEOs of multinational corporations in different hotels or energy companies that have higher influence in our power structures and can be more advocates for those that would be in section 1. This idea of targeted universalism, I really like. This is something that's been spread around as well within the equity professions. And this idea that, you know, conventionally we're always kind of looking at the middle and how can we get, you know, stabilized everything in the middle. So the idea is that we're actually prioritizing, quote unquote, the bottom versus the middle, and looking at the roots up versus the trickle down approach to initiatives, and understanding that not everyone starts from the same space, right? How are we identifying barriers and moving through that space to where if we're starting from the root, everyone benefits from it. This idea that equity and profit don't coexist very well together is something that, from an economic standpoint, looking at regenerative economic frameworks, I think is really vital and appropriate for the current situation that we're navigating through. Next slide, please. So I put these two seemingly very opposite frameworks. And I centered our Office of Climate Change in the middle because I really feel the work that my colleagues have done over the past 3 years in putting together the Oahu Resilience Strategy. If you guys aren't familiar with that, I highly recommend looking it up at resilienceoahu.org. But there's 4 pillars, 44 actions, an immense amount of work and community outreach went into this. And kind of the 4 pillars around remaining rooted, bouncing forward, climate security, and community cohesion is the first step in looking at holistic frameworks for climate change initiatives and community resiliency. If we're looking at the CDC's program BRACE, it really is explicit if you're looking at just number 2 on that list and projecting disease burdens, and that being coupled more and more with articles and research that are coming out between the significant relationships between climate change and public health and disease control, something that I've been diving into in my practice over the past couple weeks. We're looking at the BRACE framework, you know, the need to identify the scope of climate impacts associated with potential health outcomes in populations, locations vulnerable to these health impacts. That would look like, say, climate models and projections being incorporated into the medical and public sectors in assessing potential health vulnerabilities respective to climate science and data. Looking at number 2, where you're anticipating climate impacts and assessing vulnerabilities, you know, we're estimating and quantify the additional burden of health outcomes associated with climate change. And those are looking like projections and forecasting incorporated into public health planning and procedures. Number 3, looking at assessing public health interventions. And this is identifying the most suitable health interventions for the identified health impacts and greater concerns. And this would look at, you know, mitigation of negative impacts and preventative measures incorporated. So really looking at, again, the longer term holistic approaches of preventative versus reactionary. And number 4, develop and implement climate and health adaptation plan. This is like the development of written adaptation plan that is regularly updated, disseminate, and oversee implementation of the plan. So it's looking at, again, the cross sectors and institutions, how could the Office of Climate Change be a vital resource for our Department of Health and public health organizations and institutions moving forward? Number 5, evaluate impact, improve quality of activities. So this is like evaluating the process. Again, the reoccurring adaptation and adjustments as we go, because things will be changing quickly, increasingly rapidly over the years to come. And looking on the other side of the spectrum, really rooting ourselves in our indigenous wisdoms and abilities. Hawaii is very unique in that space, that we are probably one of the only states in the nation that inherently still identifies with their indigenous culture in the way that Hawaii does. And over the past 40 years since the Cultural Renaissance, the amazing amount of resilience and expansive abilities and capacity needs to be honored, as well as valued, and I think incorporated, if not centered, in our work ahead around climate change. Acknowledging the fact that the first environmentalists here in Hawaii were our Native Hawaiians, and still are in many ways. And I think one of the important things that I'm wanting to kind of bring together with this visual is we have an incredible amount of, say, left brain intelligence initiatives, mechanisms, tools and abilities right now. The importance of bringing in, balancing the cultural, social, and ecological intelligence tools, mechanisms, and abilities, I think is incredibly vital for a balanced approach moving forward. So that's kind of the work that I've been really going deeper into, and seeing what is equity to Hawaii and how are we practicing that both within our communities, but also within our government and private sectors, and incorporating solutions. And what we're looking at from that perspective, and looking at this medicine wheel, which is basically, grounded framework of how indigenous communities around the world have practiced societal development and ongoing practice for thousands of years. And, looking at traditional native knowledge systems, they're very holistic, and they include physical and metaphysical worlds linked to moral code. The emphasis on practical application of skills and knowledge are critical. And there's a big trust for inherited wisdom and a respect for all things. Practical experimentation is something that was rapidly used in the evolution of indigenous communities. Qualitative oral records, this is something that's huge in Hawaii when we're looking at data, and how can we start synthesizing more traditional forms of knowledge into contemporary forms of whether that's case studies or research that's being done. That's another really interesting space that I'm getting pulled into as well. Local verification is huge right now, and how can, who are our citizen scientists, who are climate change advocates or practitioners within small mohus and neighborhoods? How can we start shifting and repurposing our current infrastructures to be better equipped and in relationship with the on the ground community members? And I think the Office of Climate Change has a lot of opportunity right now to be able to synthesize these seemingly very polar spaces to find common ground. And those areas of common ground between seemingly these two different areas of Western indigenous knowledge, science, and practice is that, they both incorporate that the universe is unified, that bodies of knowledge, stable, but subject to modification. How do we start looking at empirical observation in natural settings that both of these sciences, seemingly opposing sciences, have? Pattern recognition, verification through repetition, and inference and prediction. These are all things that can start creating the bridge and intersection and nexus that I think will really be important as we move forward in balancing out our solutions and new forms of, whether that's economy, whether that's science, whether that's solution-based technologies. And we're already doing that in many ways. So how can we, whether it's in government or private sector, if we're looking at economic recovery, how are we doing things differently? There are going to be conventional forms that are needed to initiate stabilization, but with this disruption is a real big opportunity to do some paradigm shifting. And I really believe that our communities are ready, willing, and looking towards other ways of doing. And how can climate change be that vessel that carries and forwards this work that we're doing now? And last slide is just some information. And of course, honoring Kopuna, and just remembering our power as a small but mighty island chain in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that encompasses an incredible amount of diversity, ecologically, culturally, and resource-wise. And please feel free to reach out to the office. Please, I encourage you guys to check out the website. And we also have a One Oahu website that our office literally create and built out. We were going to use it for different purposes for some outreach, and we repurposed that website to respond to the COVID-19 needs. So mahalo so much for the opportunity to share. I hope it was valuable for you.
Thank you so much, Lala. Chip, I've stopped my screen share and I'll turn it over to you. Lala, the models that you shared, Lala, were so interesting. I can't wait to look at those further. And one thing I heard was really that there are some, ways of living that can be part of climate solutions. And I loved the phrase, moving at the speed of trust. So thank you for that.
Mahalo.
Chip, thank you. I'm seeing your screen and I'm seeing you. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Sorry, this is the interpreter. Somehow my screen got turned off, but I can't get it back on. Somebody must have turned it off.
Okay. And I see Mala. Is it? I see you, Mala. Yeah. Awesome.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks for checking. All right, Chip.
So I'm not sure what you can see. Why don't you let me know?
We see the PowerPoint, just not in full screen. But yeah, there you go. Now you're in full screen.
It is in full screen. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Wow, wonderful. It's really great to be here, and this event is very exciting. So I wanted to make some connections, to draw some dots here. An important realization I had a few years ago is that climate change doesn't exist in a vacuum, that the expansion of the human footprint in many ways, not just in changing climate, intersects with climate change, intersects with agriculture, and now we see that it's intersecting with infectious disease. Habitat destruction is the beginning of what I want to connect for you this afternoon with regard to the rise of infectious disease events. Habitat destruction is occurring through farming, logging, grazing, mining, drilling, urbanization, pollution, hunting, expansion of infrastructure, and all of this is taking place through the singular expansion of the human population on the planet and the choices we make. There's just a gruesome and unbelievably sad list of destructive facts that one can glean from the scientific peer-reviewed literature. 46%, there's been a 46% decrease in the number of trees since the start of civilization, which is 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. We currently cut down 15 billion trees each year. 40 million acres are deforested every year today on the planet. We've lost about 20% of the Amazon rainforest, and this is considered one of the, or the beginning of the range between 20 and 40% loss of the Amazon rainforest, which is thought to be a tipping point. We're now entering this tipping point range where loss may become inevitable and unstoppable on its own. We've seen a 60% decline in mammals of all types, birds, reptiles, or excuse me, of mammals, including birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish since 1970. A 50% decline or loss of shallow water corals. 80 to 90% of the world's dry lands are degraded. 87% of wetlands are gone. 35% of mangroves have been destroyed. And it's estimated that 90% of all seabirds have plastic fragments in their stomachs. And the use of industrial agriculture, which relies on pesticides and nutrients that are very poorly targeted and tend to spill off with every rain event into local watersheds and down into the coastal zones. These are killing aquatic ecosystems as well as coastal shallow water marine ecosystems. Agriculture is the primary driver of this habitat loss. Since 1970, food production has increased 300%, and half of all agriculture expansion has come at the expense of forests. We've raised an area the size of Africa, to grow animals for eating. 43% of all ice and desert-free land and nearly 75% of freshwater resources are now devoted to crop or livestock production. Over 80% of farmland is used for livestock, but it produces just 18% of food calories and 37% of protein. So we're making this global choice for meat, for chicken, pork, and beef. Cattle and the grain they eat use 1/3 of all available land surface on this planet, 16% of all available fresh water, and 1/3 of worldwide grain production is going to the beef industry. Producing beef generates 100 times more greenhouse gas than plant-based food. And monocrops of corn use synthetic pesticides and nutrients and are responsible for 78% of coastal dead zones. There's this term called cornification, which describes the fact that humans eat corn in almost every meal, even though we don't realize it. Pork, poultry, and beef are all fed from hybridized corn. And the rest of the foods we eat, other than vegetables, straight vegetables, the rest of all the processed foods have corn syrup in them, have high fructose corn syrup to give them flavor that we're addicted to. So this habitat loss, driven largely through agriculture, is bringing humans and animals into greater contact, more frequent contact. And germs are spreading from animals into people. Germs including viruses, bacteria, parasites, and less frequently fungi. These germs may exist in total equilibrium in perfectly healthy animals, but when they find a human host, they tend to turn pathogenic, and they may evolve. We have a number of animal to human diseases. Highly pathogenic avian flu still is an animal to human disease. It has not evolved into a human to human infectious disease. It's when they evolve into human to human diseases that we're faced with a new disease that is one that doesn't have a treatment, doesn't have a cure, and that can grow into a pandemic. And that's what COVID-19 has become. These are called zoonotic diseases, and you're familiar with many of these. The Ebola virus, HIV, dengue, malaria, West Nile virus, Zika virus, SARS, MERS, anthrax, Marburg virus, and COVID-19. These are all zoonotic diseases that have originally animal hosts, but have been transferred into humans and now have evolved human-to-human contact or infectiousness. In fact, 3 out of every 4 new or emerging infectious diseases come from animals. 335 diseases emerged between 1960 and 2004, and at least 60% of them came from animals. And this is not only through habitat destruction, but also through the massive expansion of our industrial animal agriculture. Very often the vectors for these, such as ticks, mosquitoes, fleas, and snails, are expanding their range because of climate change. And we have direct contact, such as the background photograph here. This is the Wuhan wet market. Any sort of contact with animal bodily fluids or putting animals next to each other that do not normally exist in nature can promote this. So these are known as spillover events, where you get a zoonotic disease that transfers from an animal to a human. Habitat destruction is increasing these. The vectors, the purveyors of these, the mosquitoes, the ticks and snails, rats and mice, they're expanding their range because of climate change as well. The common flu that we're used to every year probably had a zoonotic origin, but now it's evolved to have human-to-human contact. Every year it cycles through the Northern Hemisphere. We go and get a flu shot. Then it cycles through the Southern Hemisphere, and then a year later it comes back into the Northern Hemisphere. It will have evolved somewhat in that time period, and so you need a new flu shot to keep up with it. These highly pathogenic animal to human diseases are ones that we're very much afraid of, because once they do evolve into human-to-human contact, we may have a pandemic that's far worse than the one we currently have. So this is a graph of emerging infectious disease. And on the left side, you can see the cumulative disease events. In dark blue are those who have emerged because of the agricultural industry, including the industrialized meat industry. Slightly lighter blue is just the food industry in general, which has transferred diseases. For instance, poorly washed farm goods or lettuce, for instance. Land use itself leads to the rise of these diseases by changing ecosystems and allowing the spread of the vectors very often. And then in light blue is all of these emerging diseases together. And in the right-hand column here, you see emerging diseases associated with agriculture specific to animals, so the zoonotic emerging diseases. You can see that these are all on the rise, and they have been consistently rising since the middle of the 20th century. There's a huge social equity issue here. Agriculture can improve human health by reducing food prices and enhancing nutrition. However, freshwater habitats increase the risk of vector-borne diseases, such as malaria and somiasis. Rural residents are the most vulnerable to these infectious diseases. They're the ones who typically produce the food, and they live closest to the food and closest to the habitat destruction where the new agriculture is spreading. Whereas distant consumers, like those of us in urbanized areas, derive the most benefits from this food production. But it's at the cost and the risk of not only habitat, but the communities of humans that are producing the food. So my final slide, just thinking about future pandemics, COVID-19 fatality rate is still undetermined. There are estimates of anywhere from 3 to 10%. That is the mortality of those, the percentage of those who experience, those who die as a result of contracting COVID-19, just overall. What will we do when there is a highly pathogenic pandemic that develops with, say, a 20 to 50% mortality rate? We'll be forced to close our borders. I mean, in a way that is actually ironclad, not allowing these partially empty airplanes to continue to fly in. We'll be forced to close completely all entrance into our islands. We'll need to be fully isolated for months. And how far away are we from one of these highly fatal pandemics? As you've seen, the data indicates that these emerging diseases are growing every year. How will we feed ourselves? How will we replenish our medical stocks? Borders are taking on new significance. We've known for several years that climate change is leading to places on the planet that are increasingly unlivable and that are putting food and water security at risk, leading to a rise in human migration. Borders have taken on significance in terms of the arrival of new groups of people into an area and the either acceptance or rejection of those people by local populations. Now we have a new worry, especially in our island setting, that borders are all that protect us from these pandemics. Animal agriculture is at the heart of this problem, and our choice of what we eat is at the heart of this problem. There's a social equity component here, which is huge. Climate change maps onto this in a very big way, as well as human health. What's my one message? The most impactful personal step we can take as individuals is to eat a more plant-based diet. Thank you.
Thank you, Chip. Thank you, Lala. Thank you, Makena. Everyone, you are welcome to turn your video on if you like. I'm still processing Chip's slides there. So many powerful intersections with this information, as well as your previous talks. I'm thinking about climate-induced migration and then this new way of seeing borders. So much to think about. There's been a lot of dynamic conversation going on in the chat room, and I'd like to open it up right now for, I'm gonna unmute Matt, there you are, a little Q&A moderated by Matt Lynch, who's been tracking the action there in the chat room, and then we'll spend a little time in breakout rooms. So everyone, again, you're welcome to turn your video on or stay as you are, and we can see Makena and Lala and Chip. So thanks. Matt, what's the big question?
What's cooking? Yeah, thanks everybody for a really dynamic group chat session there. And thanks to Makena for doing an amazing job answering most of the questions that were posed to her via the chat. So there are a couple questions that kind of popped out. And Lala, also thank you for answering Shannon's question about your background. Your work really is inspiring. I might just start with a question that was posed from Justin to both Lala and Makena. And you guys can jump kind of poll who wants to take it first. Justin says, I do have one question. In the context of climate adaptation in the urban space, are there equitable solutions and initiatives that can minimize or preferably negate the socio-spatial inequities in urban adaptation measures falling into two categories: acts of commission when interventions negatively affect or displace poor communities, and acts of omission where priority is placed over economic driving communities or others? That was posed to both Lala and Makena, whoever would like to take it first.
Sure, I'm happy to respond, but Lala, do you want to go first?
No, go ahead.
Justin, that's a really good question, right? I think that, you know, how to create just transitions, both in terms of the greenhouse gas mitigation and adaptation space, is at the forefront of everybody's minds. And Lala talked about that, you know, really nicely and comprehensively. And in terms of, you know, this question of both displacement of people who can't get, you know, back on their feet, right? In terms of, you know, if we think about our coastal communities, their their levels of wealth, if you just want to put it that way, right, in terms of values of real estate, are very, very different, right? And that's, of course, not the only metric, but it is a telling metric. And so if you're talking about displacement, about communities who have the opportunities to move, if it's maybe their second or third home, that's very, very different than somebody's primary residence. And how do we create programs that can differentiate that? And I think that's a huge open question that we, you know, at this point, our programs aren't very good at differentiating between people, and sort of how do we do, you know, let's say partial buyout programs for those who wouldn't be able to otherwise move versus, say, for those who could, right? Very, very different, and our programs aren't so far set up for that. We do have good models, right? There are means tested sort of welfare programs all the time, if we look at SNAP, right? And can we take some of our learning from those models into the climate change space? I think is something to think about, right? So we're not starting from scratch. You also asked about sort of how do we keep it from just being the major sort of large economic drivers. And I think, you know, I would qualify that as like large financial economic drivers, right? I view economics as a very sort of like holistic perspective of well-being. And the financial economic drivers are huge though. And, you know, we often talk about adaptation in Waikiki because it's a huge economic driver. You know, visitor industry is about 25% of our economy, right? But that shouldn't be the way that we're basing adaptation decisions necessarily, right? We should be thinking about this more large holistic picture of well-being, and that really should be spread throughout all of our communities, thinking about how people use the beaches, gain well-being to the beaches, relate to coastlines, relate to communities. So I think we're kind of, you know, in the learning steps and beginning steps of figuring out how to do that. But I think those are the kinds of questions that are being asked in conversations that, you know, Lala's starting to lead. So with that, I'll turn it to you, Lala.
Mahalo for that. Very well said, Makena. Yeah, thank you for that question, Justin. That's a really important one. And there's a really fine line, the more that I'm learning and practicing in this space, one of the important things I think we need to do is be very explicit when we talk about sustainable economy, right? I think in general, conventionally, sustainable development has been generalized and not explicitly specifying who is benefiting, right? And so how can we start measuring these specifics? It's not necessarily the what, it's the how and the who that I think we need to really start shifting or incorporating a bit more, and probing projects, policies, and planning initiatives around this. You know, a good example of ways in which, say, our urban core could potentially be developed or mitigate inequity are examples on looking at our building codes, right? And this is thinking intergenerationally and long term that it'll cost us a bit more now to build more sustainably, but in the long run, it'll create more affordability for individuals to be able to take advantage of the sustainable technologies, green technologies that will be coming down. I think a big one for me is like, you know, the building code, Bill 25 that we've been working on rigorously in the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability and Resiliency is looking at all future buildings, right? Any future building infrastructure would have to be aligned with this building code policy to be able to incorporate clean energy in, infrastructure. For me, it's like, okay, that's really important for long term, but how can we balance it out with immediate relief or prioritizing the inequities currently? And that's really looking at like, how could we incorporate retrofitting of current structures and buildings? How could an entity like Department of Homeland or Department of Hawaiian Homelands incorporate sustainable development initiatives? Those are ways in which you're directly contributing and prioritizing frontline communities in our just transition. How are we bringing everyone along? And it really starts with prioritizing those with the greatest need and the highest stressors. You know, another component to that answer is looking at, you know, currently looking at what are financial mechanisms that are specifically benefiting or could benefit our frontline communities. We have mechanisms right now, like increase fundable tax credits for low-income families, expand MedQuest, right? Take advantage of the temporary assistance for needy families program. There's over $300 million of unspent funds right now. And how do we mitigate exacerbating what's to come over the next couple of years of this economic shift and downturn? I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Oh, no, it does. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. I want to be mindful of our time that we have till 5:30 and get us to a breakout chat. So what I'm going to do now is pose 3 questions to all 3 panelists, and you guys can decide who wants to take which question. So 3 questions, 1 question each. Pick and choose which one you want to answer. The first 2 questions come from Esme, and they're related, but they are 2 separate questions, though interrelated. And she asks, the burden of climate change is disproportionately felt by indigenous communities around the world. What is the role of returning land and of decolonization in environmental sustainability and recovery? And the follow-on question to that is returning ancestral lands a potential solution to addressing climate change locally? And Ben Trevino asks a 3rd question. Ben asks, in working towards a more equitable future, is more work/transformation required at the individual or resident level or at the organizational/institutional level? So 3 questions from 2 participants for our 3 panelists to respond to. Chip, since Makena and Lala just had a round of response, you want to kick us off and choose one to respond to?
Yeah, the first question about returning land, it just brings so many additional questions to mind. So to return land would have to be land that's not privately owned in the easiest form. So maybe we're talking about state land. And I think to return land to indigenous agricultural practices in Hawaii would be just miraculous. It would be a wonderful, wonderful thing. And more than uh, the benefits that we living in Hawaii would have from this, the demonstration and leadership that it would provide for the rest of the world would be massive. And as everybody here realizes, when it comes to the global carbon cycle, Hawaii is a rounding error, right? Our global, our greenhouse gas emissions are extremely minor, but our role as leaders and really mentors for the rest of the planet is huge. Everybody around the world recognizes that Hawaii has placed itself in a leadership position with regard to climate change. And for us to take that step with regard to agriculture, I think is just lying out there right in front of us right now, begging us to take that step, to step into it, and returning land to indigenous forms of agriculture, as well as highly technologically advanced forms of agriculture, such as warehouse ag, where you can take LED lighting and you can program the spectrum to exactly match the photosynthetic DNA of broccoli or asparagus or tomato or what have you, and you don't need pesticides and you don't need excess nutrients. So high tech to traditional indigenous, I think they are all something that we can really demonstrate enormous success with, and returning land to that purpose, I think, is the first step, and we're well poised to do so.
Mahalo, Chip. Over to you, Lala or Makena.
I'll take that. There's so many questions that I'm trying to like keep up with, and these are all like incredibly valuable questions. But I think the subject of land and the power of land ownership and who's occupying the land and what values are steering the decision making and use of that land. You know, there's approximately 30,000 Native Hawaiians on the waiting list statewide, and a third of them, almost 10,000 of them, are applying for agriculture land. And to Chip's point regarding how do we start restoring, you know, post-colonial ahupua'a systems in the 21st century, we have that capacity, I strongly feel this, to be able to do that and be a model to the world. And that's going to mean shifting in power, shifting in framework and mindsets from private and public sectors to play more partnership roles and trust, and prioritizing the root culture in these sustainable initiatives. But I'm a firm believer that we have the capacity to do it. I think there's a lot of barriers, going back to equity right now, there's a lot of barriers in the way that, you know, the work I've done over the past 10 years with place-based community organizations, practitioners, leaders, kupuna, the biggest thing for them is like, we just need some of this we just need some of this inhibiting frameworks to get out the way, because we're ready. Just allow us to reconnect, you know, or many, you know, there's a growing movement of just taking it back as well. And in taking it back in a way where they're wanting to restore and regenerate and practice over 1,000 years of understanding of how to be in equilibrium and in balance with your environment. And that's going to be central to the way that we're going to be able to maintain health and wellness for generations, for the future generations to come, as well as in the immediate next 5 to 10 years. So how could we rapidly start expanding this idea of repurposing land, right? Right now, it's the number one equity over profit, right? Like, how can we start balancing this idea that land is needs to be used in its highest profitable margin possible. And right now that's growing houses and infrastructure. That's not locally sourced food and agriculture yet. But to see just in the past week of, say, Kahumana Farms, literally went from 3 CSA boxes, community farm membership boxes, to 300, 100% increase in response by our communities. And so food is centered in this. In our nonprofit and private sector sustainable endeavors that have been building up to this point now are ready to expand. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in economic recovery to start prototyping and testing these potential opportunities to scale up.
Thank you, Lala. I could just listen to you wax lyrical for hours. Makena, that leaves the third question, which I'll repeat for everyone's benefit to you. In working towards a more equitable future, is more work/transformation required at the individual/resident level, or at the organizational/institutional level?
Okay, so let me take that question and just say, I tend to work at the policy level, so I of course see the solution, the answer to that to be at the institutional and policy levels. That doesn't mean the individual is not really, really important, right? There are aspects that the individual can really push forward, right? And if you think about just, the power of voting and the importance of that, particularly in this moment, right? Even though it might be physically difficult in the next few months, like how important is that, right? So I don't want to lose sight of the importance of the individual. But I'll say that right now we absolutely need sort of structural institutional changes, right? Mm-hmm. And to loop that back to Chip and Lala's comments, right? I mean, I sort of personally share similar feelings about self-determination and the importance of land in that mm-hmm. transition. And so if we think about land reform and decolonization, then what is the, how do we link that to greenhouse gas emissions or climate change adaptation more broadly, right? And I think there are some important links, right? And to go back to trying to link all these questions together in terms of policies and institutions, I mean, one of the things that I think many of the policy proposals that I see going through the legislature every year, where they die is the interstate commerce clause, right? This inability to preference local goods and services above non, right? There's really good reason for that law within a country, right? But it also inhibits sort of our ability as our own peoples to determine sort of the kinds of land use and the kinds of outputs that we want within our ecological systems, right? So there's that obvious tension there. So if we think about some of those barriers, they're definitely related. And, we have to keep pushing those boundaries at both structural levels and individual levels.
Mahalo, Makena. So I'm hearing even from the policy person herself, I heard both and. They're both important. They both have key roles to play. I can see that there's, from the chat, that there's still more questions coming, and obviously this is for an additional conversation. We're actually going to put everybody into breakout sessions, which Krista is going to manage the tech on that. And I will pose some guiding questions in the chat here for everybody's breakout room discussions. Note that when you're in the breakout chat, breakout discussion, my recommendation would be to turn your video on and switch to the grid view. It's just a much richer experience that way. And also, I learned this the hard way. If you type something in the group chat, everybody sees it, not just the people in your breakout chat. So keep that in mind. Krista, how long will folks have in the breakout sessions before we return to share out? I'm reading your lips, and I think you're saying 10 minutes?
10 to 12 minutes.
10 to 12 minutes, great. So The breakout questions, I'll just read them out for the video while Krista gets the breakout tech going. First off, which of the solutions that you learned about seem to be the most important in solving climate change and why? Second question, how could you ensure fairness and climate justice in carrying out these climate solutions? And third, what do you see as your personal role, if any, in helping to advance these solutions? So thanks so much for the really rich conversation and interactive Q&A. Enjoy your breakout sessions and we'll see you in 10 to 12 minutes. Well, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for rejoining us virtual dance party style. Chris is our DJ there. And as she brings us down, it's been really great to have everybody join in on this conversation. We have a little over 15 minutes left. So what I'm going to invite everybody to do is just to blow up this chat box here. And whatever your takeaways were from that breakout group discussion, go ahead and type them in that chat box. One of the great things about Zoom is we're going to be able to save that chat, and that'll be included as one of the resources that are recorded and posted on the Solve Climate by 2030 website within the week or so. I'm going to invite our three panelists, Lala, Makena, and Chip, to just share from the breakout groups that you participated in, just a quick check-in, 2 minutes or so, of some of the key things that were discussed. And maybe we'll go McKenna, Chip, and Lala, if that works, while folks still blow up that chat box. Thanks, Ben, for getting it started.
Sure. So the time went really fast. We didn't actually get through all the questions. But the thing we talked about the most was the kind of the moment of the 2020 census, and not also having sort of that lost in the COVID-19 moments. And actually, it could be that everybody's home and we're going to get record response, right? And the real importance of that in terms of what was discussed was this idea of, how do we then, get the count so that we can put resources into programs that are climate aligned, right? So Department of Transportation programs, things like that. So that was one of kind of the most concrete things that our group talked about, but we also covered a lot about takeaways on your talk, Chip, in terms of linking the global food system to COVID and what does that mean for us locally.
Great, thank you, McKenna. Chip, over to you. What was alive in your group?
We talked about ag. We talked about the importance of indigenous agriculture. Not only the practice, but I think the values of indigenous agriculture. What were the values that characterize indigenous agriculture that maybe we can inject into a modern version, a sort of digital 21st century version of indigenous agriculture? And then, as I love to do, I went off on the catastrophes that can hit Hawaii, and we don't have the capacity to feed ourselves. It's something that everybody's aware of and everybody's worried about. And, we need to do something about this.
Yeah, thank you, Chip. And thank you so much for always being the voice to remind us of
the bad cop. Yeah.
Yeah, Chris and I often wonder what it's like to be Chip Fletcher, kind of like that Being John Malkovich movie. We that would be an interesting script. We wonder who might play you. But it is no small task that you carry, and we love and appreciate you for doing it.
Thanks for those words.
Thank you. Lala, what was alive in your breakout session?
Really great thoughts. And first one was participating in civic engagement and on policy and voting, on how this the seemingly previously, the inadequacy of learning about policy and government structures and bills and those frameworks is a big discrepancy within our education system in teaching that to create responsible, civically engaged community members. But really inspired by this next generation coming up that are, I was not there at their age. And so that's where I see a lot of the hope. And how can I make space in that space I'm occupying to advocate and push the efforts of civic engagement. It's essential. Only 37% of our population votes here. There's a huge opportunity to expand that. The other thing was about individual and collective action, and it came back to food. A lot of this stuff is centering around food, and how just, reflecting in the past 5-10 years, this huge shift in trend in food. Whole Foods didn't exist 10 years ago. Organic certified farming, how Ma'o farms and Kahumana have just, grown incredibly in the past 10 years. The fish ponds, Pai Pai Oheia, those entities that, were not available to us or in rich, deep practice 10 years ago. And so how can, what's the tipping point of needing to push effort in individually until it ripple effects and takes off, and then the trend just goes, like how, making sustainability sexy. How do we make that mainstream as far as civically engaged, sustainably minded citizens? That was the other conversation that we talked about. And the last part was asked, how do I practice my work in community engagement from an equitable lens, right? And that is incredibly important, probably one of the most important questions we can put in front of our governmental and private sector leaders. How are they practicing equitable engagement, pilina, relationship building? And so I'm learning and practicing in those forms now, and using, the past 10 years of me intentionally doing place-based community development, and expanding it into climate equity and social justice initiatives. But it is really relationship building, and continuingly to show up.
Thank you so much, Lala. We're gonna turn towards wrapping up, and I want to again just thank our three incredible panelists. Give them a big virtual round of applause for all the incredible work that they do, and for taking time out of their incredibly busy schedules to be so fully present with us today and participating in our breakout sessions and sharing such a rich depth of knowledge and perspectives. I'm going to turn it back to Krista. I also want to thank each and every one of you for taking times out of your busy schedules, and just seeing all the faces, the bright faces here on the screen. I know that so many of you are involved in initiatives at the individual level and all the way out to community. And some of us here on the call are working at international scales even. And so it's this beautiful emergence of this great human fractal, and the COVID crisis really reveals a lot about ourselves and about each other and about the systems that we have built and that we are entangled in. And I think that that is always a great start for, clarity is always a great starting point for discussion and exploration. So I'll turn it back to Krista to cover some of the what happens next and to introduce our closing speaker to close us out to 5:30. Mahalo, everybody.
Thanks, Matt, and everybody. I just want to let you know what happens next. The video from today's panel will be lightly edited by Kapiolani's IT people, and the video will be posted within the week at www.solveclimateby2030.org. So you can find the video there. And that's along with curriculum design materials and some discussion guides in multiple academic disciplines, with the idea that teachers, K-12 and college, can make climate a class and really design a class around their state's panel, or might even be interesting to look at another state's panel and those solutions. So it's really going to be an incredible resource with 45 states engaging in a conversation that such as the one we had today. So I want to acknowledge Bob Franco, my colleague and mentor at Kapiolani Community College, for initiating our participation in this event and really catching that this was really going to be important. Bob, I'd like to invite you to make any closing comments, and also, you know, we're supposed to be moving toward 3 solutions. Like, what are Hawaii's top 3 things that we have to offer? So I wonder what you heard, what jumped out for you, and what you'd like to say in closing, and then we will bid everyone a hui hou.
Well, thanks all, and I'll come back to more detailed thanks to Krista in a minute. I just firmly believe that colleges and institutions, now Makena, you and I both kind of operate around institutional perspectives. I've just been dedicated for 20 years to saying what can Kapiolani Community College do to improve the quality of life for Hawaii's people, beyond just the academic, liberal arts, and career and technical training. What is the role of a community college in ameliorating or mitigating problems that seem to just come at us every day at higher and higher levels? So my perspective has always been an institutional one, well, since 2000. For my first 15 years at Kapiolani, I taught cultural anthropology. I taught about Samoan migration and cultural adaptation. I taught about the meaning of work, because a lot of students in my class were heading to career and workforce development programs. I published on Samoan fisheries, on Hawaiian management, and I always try to emphasize the meaning of work, not just work in its more mundane sort of cash-getting functions, but what is the meaning of work? And when I look at the COVID situation, and I see how the world of work has just been flipped on its head, and we haven't really grappled with, well, if there's a consensus around climate change, and there is a consensus around climate change and its impacts, why aren't we talking about work? Why aren't we talking about workforce development in different terms? Why are we still training for jobs that probably won't be here anymore? I gotta harken back to Andrew Yang and when he talked about a universal basic income. That seems so radical to many people, but geez, we just cut a check for $2 trillion like it was nothing. So it just seems to me that we haven't had the thoughtful, ongoing conversation about what is the world of work going to look like in Hawaii? And it comes up with agriculture and land and transportation and tourism and building codes. There's a lot of thoughtful conversation that needs to go into what work means for us in Hawaii and what it means for people around the world. And until we convince the working class and the working poor that climate change adaptations are going to be beneficial, we're never going to win elections, because the working class, the working poor don't see that our sort of elite efforts at the university are going to work for them. So I think there's a whole very profound set of thoughtful conversations and planning around how do we do workforce development? What kind of world of work are we preparing students for? First of all. Secondly, I have done a lot of work since the mid-90s on the work of democracy. How are we preparing students to be civically engaged, to go out and find a candidate who gets climate change and go volunteer for that candidate, help that candidate win an election. We must start winning elections. And so I think there's a whole piece, and Ula and I work very hard on this, both at Kapiolani and Mānoa, with Krista and with Denise Pearson, around how do we prepare students to be civically engaged for the work of democracy? Now that can include working for a candidate It can attend, students can begin attending public forums like the Western Pacific Fisheries Council or the Climate Change Commission. They can also attend conferences where their voices, well, first they can listen, but then they need to lend their voices for change in the way public policy gets made. And I know Joshua Cooper and others have talked about, what do our students know about advancing legislation every spring to the legislature? And might we develop a course in the fall where students are taught how to develop legislation for the subsequent spring legislative session? So those are a couple of things. I just want to finish by saying, Krista, thank you for pulling this off and figuring out the technology, and Chip and Lala and Makena, thank you for being willing so early on. And I gotta tell you, to do something like this really requires early commitment, early identification of dates and deadlines and who's gonna speak. And it couldn't have been done without Krista and the three of you stepping up right from the beginning to say you were in on this, because with the COVID thing, we could have easily not done this if we hadn't had those earlier commitments. And only speaking about commitment, this is very important, right? So the idea that you express your commitments early, often, and forever. So I think it's really helpful. There are some things we got done at the college because we did them earlier. We didn't know that COVID was going to shut the whole thing down. So I think, though, Krista and I had a conversation through our work with the National Council for Science and Environment that this form of communication is probably way more effective than running off to conferences all the time. And certainly it's going to result in fewer emissions. So I think what Krista is sort of clearly pioneered here is something that we need to do better. Finally, the community colleges, there's 1,100 of us in the country. We're all trying to struggle with what do we mean by green workforce development. And I just think that all careers need to be greened. And that's what we need to move to in our thinking about career and technical education in the community colleges, as well as professional schools at the universities. All these careers need to be greened, and certainly by 2030. So thank you for the time.
Mahalo, everyone. Ahui ho.